The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Sufi Thought and Action by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. An Appraisal of Sufi Learning Methods by Benjamin Ellis Ford. The present climate of research and interest in traditional systems of life and learning greatly favours the study of those which have been preserved for centuries by the Sufis, a body of people commonly styled Islamic mystics, but whose teachings, both according to them and many, if not all of their commentators, reach back into the human past beyond written records. Materials on the Sufis are contained in the books which their exponents have written, and in accounts by travellers and residents in the Middle East, where they have been chiefly located, which cover a period of approximately 1200 years under the name Sufi. The materials are so miscellaneous and, for many, confusing that it has never been possible, in spite of several intensive attempts, to provide a rationale of what the Sufis do, why and in what manner, which will embrace all the acceptedly legitimate materials available. It is not a matter of too little material, but of too much. As one commentator has said, if we had handed down to us only a little about the Sufis, we would have been able to effect a plausible reconstruction of their ideas and practices which might not have been accurate, but which would certainly have satisfied our desire for order and to close the books. Unfortunately, we cannot do this, for the materials are too abundant. Passing over this sad commentary upon our methods of running the profession of learning, it soon becomes apparent that sense may sometimes be made even from such a complex manifestation as that of the Sufis, by seeking the information and interpretation from the Sufis themselves. This process, which the present author has followed as far as humanly possible, reveals that there are, roughly speaking, two ways of looking at Sufi, and who knows, perhaps many other kinds of manifestations. One, from the point of view of fixed assumptions which the researcher has brought with him into the equation, and two, in accordance with what the Sufis themselves have to say about their activity. What follows is substantially the collection of interpretations about Sufis and Sufism, which originated in extensive travels and questionings, armed with questionnaires derived from the available books on the Sufis which have been written by experts. It is not too much to say that the Sufis have been considerably surprised at the lack of information and lackluster mentality of the average researcher. The first obvious matter of interest is contained in the question, and its answer: what are the Sufis for, why do they exist, and what are they trying to do? In this, happily, there seems to be no confusion on the part of the Sufis, whatever motives, history, or objectives the specialists may care to father upon them. The Sufis, according to statements which command the acceptance of their own authorities, know how to dispel those things which stand between the human being and his or her perception of human origin and destiny, setting aside as irrelevant to this journey the division between life before birth, during life as we know it, and after death. The Sufi assertion is that humanity was created for a purpose, knew what this purpose was before assuming what is characterized as the human guise, forgot what this was at the point of birth, starts to remember it under appropriate stimuli, and continues to exist after physical death in a sense which has been modified by the terrestrial phase. Although this formulation may sound, to contemporary ears, like something out of science fiction, it was well established and widely credited in this form many centuries before the devising of the science fiction genre, with all that that implies. Sufis deny the absolute reality of time, space, and physical form. These things, they say, are both relative and local. They only appear to be absolute. This, then, is the Sufi assertion. What of the application of methods to encourage the awakening, Sufi phrase, of the sleeper, their word for man? The Sufi answer to this differs so dramatically from all the other religio-mystical conceptions that it is perhaps not surprising that some people cannot really grasp it. And yet it does not seem, once grasped, to be incompatible with any veracity of the basic argument. They say, in brief, that when the knowledge of how past, present, and future are connected is experienced by a Sufi master, it is his ability to devise the methods. Further, such methods are not only unstandardized, they must be so. There are as many paths to truth as there are souls of men, Sufi phrase. The Sufis therefore regard systems which treat everyone alike as mechanical and degenerate. They do not deny either that many supposedly Sufi entities have become oversimplified to such an extent, after falling into the hands of imitators, that they have lost the power to do more than automatize their followers. This, indeed, they regard as an inevitable consequence of the effects of time itself. In other words, our desire for order and our haste to organize leads to a demand for oversimplification, which causes teaching to become indoctrination, and originally meaningful activity to become ritual. It is difficult to reverse this process and to reclaim flexibility because of a demand for order which is so powerful, as are many other lower-level aspirations, that it grips its victims like a disease. The Sufi approaches his task from whatever point he is able. The first consideration in many cases is the observation that people in general are so habituated to making habits that everything presented to a human being will be warped, by him, into a habit. The answer to this, according to the Sufi, is not to break habits, because many habits are important. The solution is to guide the learner to a position in which he can both have habits and manage to operate without them. The analogy which is used by modern Sufis is of an automatic mechanism which has an override, which enables it to be operated at will. This, in turn, leads to one of the most baffling aspects of Sufi activity: discontinuity. The Sufi claims that in addition to rhythm and its effects, there are phases within the human being which can be contacted and employed to enable him to think, to work, and to exist outside of familiar time and repetitiousness. Human beings, however, have an affinity for repetition. Sufi techniques explore the switchover from continuity to discontinuity by a large number of devices, both literary, physical, and mental. Many of Sufi exercises are in fact based upon this conception. It follows from this that people who are not able to switch attention from repetition to discontinuity will not be able to benefit from such techniques, even if they know what they are. It is for this reason that a Sufi teacher is always needed. Unregenerate man will always automatize inputs, and only someone who is consciously outside of time as well as within it can hold the line. The second training requirement that is marked among the Sufi teachers is based on an understanding of the tendency to accept or to reject. Most human institutions are based on the binary mode either-or. Faced with almost any situation, the human being will automatically decide, as quickly as possible, whether to accept or reject it. This, say the Sufis, provides a useful tool for ordinary learning and indoctrination, but when it becomes the only mode of approach to a situation, it effectively screens the individual from other perceptions, other areas of experience where this mode is absent. The attempt at introducing a middle way, indecision, evaluation, and so on, only imports an uncertainty into the situation, and does not, they aver, constitute the establishment of a third specific potentiality, which they hold to be essential. Vanity and self-assertion, which have been struggled against, one feels generally with little success, by virtually every religion, are also regarded by the Sufis as harmful to the realization process. They do not, however, stress the reward and punishment aspect of too much vanity. To them, vanity is a barrier to learning. Not to be able to learn or to progress is just as deadly for the Sufi as being damned or ceasing to exist is in other dispensations. The initial training among the Sufis, concentrating upon modesty and repentance, is indeed held by them to be both the essential foundation of all human spiritual progress, and also certainly in their eyes, the original teaching of which the religionized versions, mere emotional or social blackmail, are degenerations. After modesty comes symbolism. I have time and again noted that genuine Sufis are almost baffled that those who copy them are unaware that the Sufi teachings contain layer upon layer of meanings, and that one cannot pass to a second meaning until a primary one has been absorbed. The consequence of the failure of the imitators to understand this, even in theory, is that for the Sufi no outside inquirer is able to make any progress at all in real Sufism, but remains, as it were, churning up the surface of the water like a pond fly, while at the same time making journeys all over the East, teaching others because of his experiences, writing books, doing dervish dances, and generally behaving in a manner which the Sufi himself regards as first-class evidence of incompetence and superficiality. One of the reasons for the well-known penchant of the Sufis for discouraging admirers or applicants for knowledge is to force them to re-examine the real depth of their knowledge and sincerity. It may take, one Sufi told me, 5 or even more approaches covering several years before we have been able to signal effectively enough to the applicant that we would be glad to help him if he would only amend his own feelings of self-importance. What proportion of those who are thus diverted actually return that number of times? I asked him. Less than 1 in 10. 9 will decide that we are nasty people. Some even go away quite unconscious that they have been reproached, so vain are they, and start to teach. But if the foregoing special characteristics of the Sufis cause general alarm or confusion, this is nothing to the degree of misunderstanding which originates in another typical feature of Sufi practice. I refer to the fact that there are many apparently different systems of Sufi study. Not only are there reported musical and rhythmic assemblies, there are formulations which appear to show that Sufis dislike music or favour it, that they practice loud or only silent vocations, that there are 6, 9, 10, 17, and any other number of stages and stations of the way. Some people say that they work on activating sensitive perception spots on the head and body, like the yogic chakras. Others hold that the Sufi methods require repetitions, memorizing, and almost any kind of spiritual or other practice which you can imagine. How can this be? The real answer, which is not to be found in any of the 2,250 books or monographs on the subject which I have studied, comprising effectively the entire bibliography of Sufism which the world can offer, is amazingly simple. All one has to do is to ask a real Sufi. Sufis, the answer goes, will employ any method in their teachings which will actually work. They are not tied to any traditional formula whatever. The use of many different kinds of methods by various teachers has given rise to the assumption that such and such a method is the real way among imitators. So if nowadays you ask one of the many thousands of imitators, or sincere but misled followers of one-time imitators, as to the facts about the standardization of methods among the Sufis, they will give you an answer which does not originate with the Sufis at all, but with dervishes, people who have tried, usually unsuccessfully, to become Sufis. What is interesting about the fact that Sufi teachers choose their own techniques is that the fact that this is possible at all tends to support the Sufi assertion that the Sufi actually knows the way from having trodden it. In contradistinction, the very fact that people in other systems cleave so strongly to repetition, traditionalism and rote, imitation and ritual could well be taken to mean that the actual insight as to what actually does work is absent. This point is worth pondering. Worth pondering, of course, it may be. Whether it will be pondered is another matter. The reason for this unlikelihood, it seems to me, is that in most human societies there is little conception that there may be a way which is open and which is known and understood by its sponsors. In the West, for instance, the reverence for authority and the attachment to fixed forms must surely stem from a subconscious belief that there is no access to truth today, only repetition of what people in the past have said one should do and believe. Similarly, in the Far East, traditionalism surely spells conviction that what was once done and believed must surely produce results today. The existence of people who say, as it were, forget tradition, follow experience, must be very small. Otherwise, we would not find it hard to keep in our minds the possibility that some may be able to do something without particular, frequent, or even plausible reference to standard authorities. Sufi teaching techniques, in their true form, depend very much upon an interrelation between master and disciple, and between these two and the whole community of mystics. The current which flows between these, according to the Sufis, is the most important element in their being and progress. Given this statement, it is possible to discern that many so-called Sufi groupings and teachers are in fact no such thing, for the element of the current is absent. The sporadic nature of the Sufi activity, when there may be a lecture or a series of exercises, there may be a lecture or distinct instruction, or there may not, from time to time in a real Sufi school, ties in with this current. The fluctuation of activity parallels the fluctuation of potentiality and the knowledge of the teacher in a way which is not to be found, so far as I am aware, in other systems. This does not necessarily prove that the Sufi system is true or superior, but it does imply a strong distinction which is not noted, so far as I am aware, in the literature. This characteristic of fluctuation leads naturally into another of the strange aspects of Sufi teaching organization. The strangeness lies in the fact that, unlike other mystical or philosophical systems, Sufis often organize their studies around communities and enterprises which are not instantly recognizable as spiritual. Everyone, for instance, in the East and West, knows what a monastery is. As a settlement or collection of people, it may well run enterprises of an economic kind: agriculture, beekeeping, the manufacture of wines or spirits, various crafts. But these activities are always looked upon as things which help to contribute to the upkeep of the foundation. With the Sufis, however, they strangely operate all kinds of enterprises. A Sufi school may center around a colony of tinsmiths, or a factory, shop, or even the running of a large house and grounds. Even some of the repetitious and formalized groupings sometimes retain vestiges of this concept. Among the Bektashis, for instance, are to be found the relics of a family, with certain functionaries known as the cook, the groom, and so on. In Central Asia, this tradition is perpetuated, in name though not in action, by the use of the term khanawat, family, to style a Sufi group. A very large number of ancient Sufi organizations stem from chivalry, another format, with tabards still being carried, they know not why, by wandering dervishes in Iran, and swords hanging on the walls of tekiyas, Sufi meeting places, as widely dispersed as Bosnia and Xinjiang. The reason for the different formats, in addition to the fact that they signal the teacher's flexibility to teach within any framework, is that the principle of fluctuation within form must be maintained. That is to say, if the teacher has to maintain contact and a relationship with his followers while waiting, as it were, for propitious times to carry out the practices which alone bring enlightenment, he must have a form within which to maintain the coherence of the group. In deteriorated systems, that form is wholly religious. People wear special clothes, pray and meditate and so on at stated times. They have, in fact, become automatized. With the Sufis, on the other hand, the primary need is to keep the decks clear for the moment when the teaching can take place. This requires that the attention should be focused upon the teaching only when it is able to operate, while other activities are carried out in the intervening time. Seen from one perspective, of course, this all means that the Sufis are creating a socio-economic group which fulfills the function of being in the world but not of it, Sufi slogan, yet at the same time not exhausting the spiritual energy by dwelling on emotional and evocative thoughts, prayers, litanies, readings, and so on, which operate on people in a conditioning manner. It has to be admitted that the principle underlying this interesting organization might lead one to suppose that there really is one unusual insight at work. The abandonment or absence of the principle in virtually all other spiritually oriented societies should not blind us to the possibility that here we find a method and a knowledge that could really be almost unknown elsewhere. Is this the Sufi secret? The existence of these organizations, of course, depends, according to the Sufis, upon the existence of Sufis with the necessary knowledge to set up what seem to be profane organizations, but which are yet subtly related with the teaching, the disciples, and the outside world. Since the reality behind seemingly non-religious entities was announced some years ago by the Sufi authority Idries Shah, some attempts have been made to set up supposedly Sufi farms, camps, businesses, and so on, almost always by people who were merely imitating. As has been noted with regard to Sufis many times in the past, the compulsion to imitate is not always a sign of deceit, though it is almost invariably a sign of immaturity. Readers are warned, therefore, not to adopt just any Sufi organization because it claims to be working along the lines of worldly organization with an inner content. All authentic Sufis are in direct contact, and there is in the world at any one moment only one Sufi entity which manipulates the totality of the Sufi activity. The existence of such a finely tuned instrument as a total Sufi organization, with its own organs of communication and its own programs founded upon direct perception of truth beyond appearances, of course, makes nonsense of almost all our attempts to study Sufis through secondary sources. Further, it makes laughable the careful examination of Sufi prayers, exercises, and methods which are looked at in isolation. A Sufi, if he is working in attunement with a total operation, will never be able to indicate, any more than an observer can perceive, what the actual function of the said exercise, etc. really is, for it is nothing at all when torn from context. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.